The year was 1978. The place was Harlan County, a region carved into the Appalachian Mountains where coal dust settled on everything like a second skin. Here, in a valley so remote that even the Postal Service had given up decades prior, stood a weathered cabin that had housed the same family for over 130 years, the Caldwells. A name that would eventually become synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases of multi-generational consanguinity ever recorded in American medical history. Martha Caldwell, 63 years old, sat on her porch that October morning, rocking slowly in a chair her grandfather had built. Her face was weathered, deeply lined, with eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. She was waiting. She had been waiting for 9 months, though her expression suggested she had been waiting far longer than that. Inside the cabin, her daughter Rebecca, just 19 years old, was in labor. But Rebecca was not just Martha's daughter. Rebecca was also Martha's granddaughter, and the father of Rebecca's unborn twins was Rebecca's own brother, James, who was simultaneously the uncle of the children about to be born. The mathematical horror of the family tree was difficult to comprehend. Martha herself had been born from a union between her mother and her mother's father. Martha had then given birth to Rebecca and James after relations with her own father, making the children both siblings and uncle-niece, aunt-nephew to each other. The bloodline had folded in on itself so many times that geneticists who would later study the family records would need charts spanning entire walls to map the twisted branches. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a physician from Lexington who had somehow found her way to this forgotten pocket of Kentucky through a regional health initiative, stood inside the cabin now, her medical bag trembling slightly in her hands. She had seen poverty. She had seen neglect, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing in this dim, kerosene-lit room. Rebecca lay on a bed that sagged in the middle, her body convulsing with contractions. Her face, though young, bore the unmistakable signs of genetic degradation. Her eyes sat slightly too far apart, her jaw was undersized, and her teeth, visible when she screamed, were crowded and malformed. Her hands, gripping the stained sheets, had fingers that bent at unusual angles, the bones clearly affected by the compressed gene pool from which she had emerged. Dr. Vance had tried to convince the family to go to a hospital in Harlan, 27 miles away. Martha had refused. "Caldwells are born here," she had said simply, with a finality that left no room for argument. "Caldwells die here. That's how it's been. That's how it'll be." James, 21 years old, stood in the corner of the room, his presence both necessary and deeply disturbing. His role in this situation was understood but never spoken aloud. He was tall but stooped, as if his spine couldn't quite support his frame. His face bore a striking resemblance to Rebecca's, the same wide-set eyes, the same weak chin. They looked like siblings because they were siblings. They looked like each other because their parents were also their grandparents. The first twin emerged just after noon. Dr. Vance's hands, steady despite her horror, guided the infant into the world. The baby boy did not cry. His body was small, far too small for a full-term infant. His head was misshapen, elongated at the back, with a pronounced ridge along the skull. His eyes, barely open, were clouded with cataracts. His fingers were fused together at the second knuckle, creating a paddle-like appearance. 20 minutes later, the second twin followed. This one did cry, a weak mewling sound that barely filled the room. He was slightly larger than his brother, but the deformities were, if anything, more pronounced. His legs bowed severely inward, the bones visible through translucent skin that seemed too thin to contain a human body. A cleft split his upper lip and extended into his nostril. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle. Dr. Vance wrapped the infants in the cleanest cloth she could find, her medical training battling with the profound moral crisis unfolding before her. These children were alive, but they were born into bodies that had been betrayed by the very blood that created them. They were the end product of a genetic experiment that nature never intended, a bloodline that had consumed itself. Martha entered the room slowly, her weathered face showing no surprise, only a deep, ancient sadness. She looked at the twins with recognition, as if she had been expecting exactly this outcome. She reached out and touched the first twin's malformed hand with surprising gentleness. "They're Caldwells," she said quietly. "Born already half buried, just like the rest of us." Outside, the October wind swept through the hollow, carrying with it the smell of decaying leaves and coal smoke. The Caldwell cabin sat in shadow, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed this family's slow genetic collapse for over a century. The trees, ancient hemlocks and oaks, stood as silent witnesses to a tragedy that had been unfolding in slow motion for generations. Dr. Vance would later testify that she had never seen anything like the Caldwell family in her 30 years of medical practice. The twins, whom Rebecca would name Elijah and Ezekiel, represented the culmination of at least 5 generations of continuous consanguineous relations. Every genetic defect, every recessive condition, every hidden flaw in the family's DNA had been amplified and concentrated until it manifested in these 2 fragile bodies. But the twins were not the first. They were simply the most recent. In the small family cemetery behind the cabin, hidden beneath overgrown weeds and collapsed wooden markers, lay the bodies of dozens of Caldwell children who had not survived infancy. Some had lived for hours, some for days. A few had made it to their first birthday. The ground was rich with the bones of children who had been born into the same genetic trap, each generation slightly worse than the last. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal, because what you're about to discover goes far deeper than one family's tragedy. This is a window into the darkest consequences of isolation and forbidden bloodlines that society tried to bury. The Caldwell family's descent into genetic catastrophe did not begin with Martha, nor with her parents. It began in 1847 when Josiah Caldwell, a coal prospector from Virginia, ventured into the eastern Kentucky mountains and never came back out. Josiah was 26 years old when he built the original cabin in what would become known as Caldwell Hollow. He had come seeking coal deposits, and he found them, a rich seam running through the mountain that could have made him wealthy. But Josiah was a man who valued isolation more than fortune. He had left Virginia under circumstances that were never fully explained, and the remoteness of the hollow suited his temperament perfectly. He married a Cherokee woman named Amma, one of the few remaining members of a small band that had avoided the forced removals of the 1830s. They had 7 children together, 4 daughters and 3 sons. When Amma died in 1862 from complications related to her 7th childbirth, Josiah faced a dilemma that would seal his family's fate. The nearest settlement was a 3-day journey on foot. He had children ranging from age 2 to 15. The Civil War was raging, and the mountains were dangerous with deserters and raiders. Josiah made a decision that seemed practical in his isolated world. When his eldest daughter, Sarah, turned 16 in 1863, he took her as his wife. She bore him 5 more children. When Sarah died in 1871, his second daughter, Mary, stepped into the role. The pattern had been established. By the 1880s, the Caldwell family consisted entirely of individuals who were the products of father-daughter unions. The genetic diversity that protects populations from the concentration of harmful traits had been eliminated. Every recessive gene, every potential defect, now had nowhere to hide. Census records from 1890 show the Caldwell household consisting of Josiah, now 69, his daughter-wife Ruth, 32, and 11 children ranging from newborn to 14. A note in the census taker's journal, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society, reads, "Family in remote hollow. Unusual appearance. Many children with ailments. Did not inquire further." The first documented medical examination of the Caldwell family came in 1923, when a public health nurse named Virginia Holbrook made her way to the Hollow as part of a rural health survey. Her report, buried in state archives until its rediscovery in 1982, makes for disturbing reading. The family consists of approximately 27 individuals, all living in or near the original cabin structure, Holbrook wrote. Observed severe instances of intellectual impairment in over half the children, multiple cases of skeletal deformities, including bowed legs, curved spines, and malformed joints, high infant mortality, 3 children observed with clouded eyes, likely cataracts. 2 adults displayed signs of profound hearing loss. 1 teenage girl had a cleft palate so severe she could barely speak. The family patriarch, who identified himself as Elijah Caldwell, grandson of the original settler, showed marked signs of cognitive decline despite being only 42 years old. Holbrook's report recommended immediate intervention, including relocation of the children and medical treatment. The report was filed and forgotten. The Hollow was too remote, the family too resistant to outside help, and the resources of the Kentucky Health Department too limited to pursue the matter. The Caldwells continued their isolated existence, generation after generation, each one slightly more compromised than the last. By the 1950s, the family's genetic degradation was accelerating. Children were being born with conditions that should have been extraordinarily rare. Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome, resulting in dwarfism and extra fingers, congenital deafness, severe intellectual disabilities, heart defects, kidney malformations. Martha Caldwell, born in 1915, was herself the product of a grandfather-granddaughter union. Her mother, Judith, had given birth to Martha at age 14 after relations with Judith's own grandfather, the same Elijah Caldwell that Virginia Holbrook had examined. Martha's father was simultaneously her great-great-grandfather. Martha grew up understanding that the Caldwell way of life was different, but in the profound isolation of the Hollow, different did not mean wrong. It simply meant theirs. She had never attended school. She had never seen a town. Her entire world consisted of the cabin, the surrounding forest, the family cemetery, and the faces that all looked disturbingly similar to her own. When Martha was 15 in 1930, her father approached her with the expectation that had governed Caldwell women for 3 generations. She would become his wife, just as his mother had been wife to her father and her mother before that. Martha accepted this as inevitability. 9 months later, she gave birth to twins who lived for 3 days before succumbing to heart defects. Over the next 30 years, Martha would give birth to 14 children. Only 6 survived past infancy. Of those 6, only Rebecca and James lived beyond age 10. The family cemetery filled with small graves, unmarked except for rocks placed at the head and foot. The pattern repeated with mathematical precision: conception, pregnancy, birth, brief life, death, burial. By the time Rebecca was born in 1959, Martha was 44 years old and deeply worn by the physical toll of so many pregnancies and so much loss. Rebecca was small and weak at birth, with the telltale signs that marked all Caldwell children: the wide-set eyes, the undersized jaw, the slight tremor in her hands that indicated neurological compromise. James, born in 1957, was stronger but showed other signs of the genetic burden he carried. His hearing was poor in one ear. His vision required him to squint constantly. His teeth had come in so crowded that several had to be pulled when he was 12, yanked out by Martha with pliers from the tool shed while James screamed into a leather strap. The siblings grew up together in the Hollow, their world bounded by mountains on all sides. They fished in the creek that ran past the cabin. They tended the small vegetable garden. They learned to snare rabbits and shoot squirrels, and as they entered adolescence they understood, without anyone explicitly telling them, what would be expected when the time came. When Rebecca was 16 and James 18, the cycle continued. The family tree, already incomprehensibly tangled, added another impossible branch. Rebecca became pregnant in the summer of 1975. Martha, now 60, prepared for what she knew would come. Another generation of Caldwells, another round of genetic catastrophe. Dr. Eleanor Vance stayed in Caldwell Hollow for 3 days after the twins were born, monitoring Rebecca's recovery and trying to assess the infant's conditions with limited equipment. What she observed filled notebooks that would later become crucial evidence in medical journals. Elijah, the firstborn twin, had suffered severe oxygen deprivation during birth, compounding his already extensive list of genetic disorders. His brain, Dr. Vance suspected, had been damaged. He did not respond to light. He did not track movement. His body remained rigid, locked in a posture that suggested constant pain. Ezekiel, the second twin, was more responsive, but in many ways more heartbreaking. His eyes, though clouded, seemed to focus on faces. His malformed hands would grasp at fingers placed in his palm. He was aware, trapped in a body that had been sabotaged before he drew his first breath. Dr. Vance tried to convince Martha to allow the twins to be taken to a hospital where they could receive proper care and where their conditions could be properly documented. Martha refused with the same quiet finality she had shown before. "They're Caldwells," she repeated. "They stay here." On the 4th day, Dr. Vance left the hollow, carrying with her detailed notes and a profound sense of failure. She reported the situation to county social services, to the health department, to anyone who would listen. The response was bureaucratic inertia. The family was remote. They were refusing help. Resources were limited. The case file was opened and then effectively closed. But Dr. Vance could not let it go. Over the next 2 years, she would make the difficult journey to Caldwell Hollow 6 more times, each visit revealing the slow-motion tragedy unfolding in that isolated cabin. Elijah never developed beyond the level of a newborn. He did not learn to focus his eyes. He did not smile. He did not reach for objects. He lay in a wooden cradle that James had built, his malformed body barely growing, fed milk from a bottle every few hours by Rebecca, who approached the task with mechanical detachment. Ezekiel developed slightly more. By 6 months, he could track faces with his clouded eyes. By 1 year, he could make sounds, though not words. His fused fingers prevented him from grasping objects properly, but he would wave his paddle-like hands when he heard Rebecca's voice. His bowed legs meant he would likely never walk, but he learned to drag himself across the floor using his arms, a heartbreaking form of locomotion that left him exhausted after just a few feet. Martha watched the twins with the sadness of someone who had seen this script played out too many times. She had buried too many children, too many grandchildren, too many great-grandchildren. The family cemetery behind the cabin had more graves than living Caldwells. The bloodline was consuming itself, each generation weaker than the last, until there would be nothing left but empty cabins and overgrown graves. James, now the only adult male in the hollow, bore his role with silent resignation. He hunted to provide meat. He maintained the cabin as best he could with tools that were decades old. He avoided looking at the twins, as if not seeing them might make their existence less real. Rebecca, at 21, looked 40. The physical toll of carrying and birthing the twins had aged her dramatically. Her teeth, already poor, had begun falling out. Her back bent under the constant strain of carrying and caring for infants, who required more attention than healthy babies. Her hands shook constantly now, the neurological condition that had been mild in childhood now progressing rapidly. The hollow itself seemed to decay in sympathy with the family. The cabin's roof leaked in a dozen places. The front porch sagged dangerously. The small vegetable garden produced less each year, the soil exhausted from over a century of cultivation without proper fertilization. The forest encroached, reclaiming cleared land, as if nature itself was trying to erase the evidence of the Caldwell family's existence. Winter came to the hollow in November 1980, earlier and harder than usual. Snow fell in heavy blankets, covering the cabin and the cemetery, isolating the family even more completely. The creek froze. The road, barely more than a track even in summer, became impassable. Elijah, who had never been strong, developed pneumonia in December. His breathing, already labored, became desperate gasping. Dr. Vance had left antibiotics on her last visit, but Martha was unsure how to administer them properly. She did her best, spooning liquid medicine into the infant's mouth, while Rebecca held him upright to prevent choking. It was not enough. On December 19, 1980, 2 years and 2 months after his birth, Elijah stopped breathing. He was buried the next day in the family cemetery, in a grave dug by James through frozen ground. No marker was placed. The Caldwells did not mark infant graves. There were too many. If you felt your heart break for these children, leave a comment saying they deserved better than this bloodline gave them, to honor their memory and ensure their story is never forgotten. Ezekiel, now alone, seemed to sense his brother's absence. He became quieter, his small vocalizations ceasing almost entirely. He stopped waving his malformed hands. He ate less. Dr. Vance, who visited in January 1981, noted that the surviving twin appeared to be giving up, a phenomenon she had read about in medical literature but never witnessed, twins who could not survive the loss of their sibling. The end of the Caldwell family came not with dramatic finality, but with slow, inevitable erosion, like a mountain worn down by centuries of rain. Ezekiel survived his brother by 7 months. In that time, he grew minimally, his body trapped in the same infant-like state, despite his age. His clouded eyes gradually lost all ability to track light or movement. His vocalizations stopped completely. He became a silent, still presence in the cabin, fed and changed with mechanical regularity by Rebecca, who seemed to be operating on pure routine, her mind elsewhere. When Ezekiel died in July 1981 from complications related to kidney failure, a condition he had been born with, Rebecca did not cry. She simply informed Martha, who informed James, who dug another small grave in the cemetery. The burial happened the same day, in the heat of summer, with only the 3 surviving Caldwells present. Dr. Vance learned of Ezekiel's death 3 weeks later, when she made her scheduled visit. She found Rebecca sitting on the porch, staring at nothing. Martha was in the garden, pulling weeds with slow, arthritic movements. James was nowhere to be seen. "They're both gone," Martha said without preamble when Dr. Vance approached. "Just as well. This bloodline is finished." "Doctor," Vance convinced Martha in that moment of grief and exhaustion to allow her to document the family's history. Over the next 6 months, Dr. Vance made weekly trips to the Hollow, recording oral histories, examining old family Bibles, photographing the cemetery, and collecting what medical information she could. What emerged was a portrait of genetic catastrophe spanning 5 generations. Dr. Vance estimated that over the 133 years of the family's isolation, at least 75 children had been born into the Caldwell line. Of those, only 18 had survived to adulthood. Of those 18, all showed signs of genetic disorders ranging from mild to severe. The mathematical probability of the concentration of recessive genes in the Caldwell family was astronomical. Conditions that should appear in 1 in 10,000 births appeared in nearly every Caldwell child. The coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic relatedness, was higher in the Caldwell family than in any other documented human population. Dr. Vance's research was published in 1983 in the American Journal of Medical Genetics under the title Genetic Consequences of Multi-Generational Consanguinity, a case study from rural Appalachia. Deal. The paper used pseudonyms and did not identify the exact location of the family, but within medical and anthropological circles, it became a landmark study of the dangers of genetic isolation. The publication brought unwanted attention to Caldwell Hollow. Journalists attempted to locate the family. Documentary filmmakers sought permission to visit. Graduate students wanted to conduct further studies. Martha refused all contact. She had allowed Dr. Vance to tell the story because she trusted her, but she wanted no part of becoming a spectacle. In 1985, Martha Caldwell died at age 70, her body finally giving out after decades of hard living and harder births. She was buried in the family cemetery, in a plot she had selected years earlier near the graves of her mother and grandmother. James and Rebecca, now the only surviving Caldwells, conducted the burial alone. With Martha gone, the maintenance of the cabin became impossible. James was 48 years old, but looked 70, his body worn out by a lifetime of hard labor and genetic disadvantage. Rebecca, at 46, was nearly blind. Her vision deteriorated beyond what simple glasses could correct. Together, they struggled to maintain even basic subsistence. In 1987, a severe winter storm damaged the cabin's roof beyond James's ability to repair it. Snow and rain poured into the interior, ruining what little furniture and possessions the family had. James and Rebecca moved to a smaller outbuilding, barely more than a shed, while the main cabin slowly collapsed. Dr. Vance, still checking on the family, found them in deplorable conditions during a visit in spring 1988. She convinced them finally to accept relocation assistance from the state. They were moved to a subsidized housing facility in Harlan, the first time either had lived anywhere but the Hollow. The transition was devastating. James, who had never been around more than 5 people at a time, could not adapt to the noise and proximity of other humans. He became withdrawn, refusing to leave his room, refusing to eat. 3 months after the relocation, he died of what the death certificate listed as heart failure, but what Dr. Vance believed was simply the inability to exist outside the only world he had ever known. Rebecca survived longer, living in the facility until 1993. She was nearly blind by then, her hearing nearly gone, her body bent and broken by decades of malnutrition and genetic disorder. She rarely spoke. When she did, it was about the Hollow, about the cabin, about the cemetery where so many Caldwells lay. She died on a Tuesday in March, in a small room that smelled of antiseptic and old age, surrounded by people who did not know her story. She was buried in a county cemetery, miles from the Hollow, where her family had existed for nearly a century and a half. The Caldwell cabin stands empty now, or what remains of it. The roof has collapsed entirely. The walls lean inward, ready to surrender to gravity. The forest has reclaimed much of the clearing, saplings pushing up through the porch boards, vines covering the windows. The family cemetery is still there, hidden behind overgrown brush and fallen trees. The graves are unmarked, but they are there, dozens of them, small mounds in the earth where children who were born, already half buried, found their final rest. In 1995, Dr. Eleanor Vance, now retired, returned to Caldwell Hollow one final time. She was 71 years old and knew she would not make the difficult journey again. She wanted to see the place where she had witnessed one of the most profound human tragedies of her career. She stood in the cemetery, counting the graves she could identify. She estimated at least 60 burial sites, though the exact number would never be known. Some had sunk and disappeared. Some had been obscured by time and vegetation. But they were there, silent testament to the cost of isolation and the dangers of bloodlines that fold back on themselves. Dr. Vance placed a single stone marker at the entrance to the cemetery. It bore no names, only an inscription. Here lie the children of Caldwell Hollow. May they rest in the peace they were denied in life. The marker still stands, though few know where to find it. The hollow is accessible only by foot, a difficult hike through rough terrain. Occasionally hikers stumble upon the ruins of the cabin and the hidden cemetery. Some take photographs, some leave flowers. Most simply feel an overwhelming sadness and leave quickly, as if the land itself carries the weight of all that suffering. The scientific legacy of the Caldwell family extends far beyond that hollow in eastern Kentucky. Dr. Vance's research became foundational in understanding the genetic consequences of consanguinity. Medical schools use the case study to teach genetic counseling. Anthropologists reference it when discussing isolated populations. Sociologists examine it as a case study in the intersection of poverty, isolation, and family structure. But beyond the academic interest, beyond the scientific data, the Caldwell family represents a profoundly human tragedy. They were people, not specimens. They loved, struggled, hoped, and suffered. They were trapped by circumstances of geography, poverty, and cultural isolation that made their choices seem inevitable. The twins, Elijah and Ezekiel, born in 1978 into bodies sabotaged by generations of genetic concentration, lived their brief lives in that cabin, never knowing a world beyond its walls, never experiencing the possibilities that healthy bodies and minds might have offered them. They were, as Martha said, born already half buried, their fates sealed before they drew breath. The hollow is silent now. The creek still runs, though the cabin no longer sits beside it. The mountains still stand, indifferent to the human drama that unfolded in their shadow. The trees grow, the seasons change, nature has moved on, but the graves remain. And in those graves lies a warning, a reminder of what happens when isolation becomes absolute, when bloodlines turn inward, when the genetic diversity that protects populations is eliminated. The Caldwell family paid the ultimate price for their isolation, generation after generation, until the bloodline simply consumed itself and ceased to exist. The last Caldwell died in 1993. The hollow where they lived for 146 years is empty, but their story, preserved in medical journals and archived reports and the memories of the few who knew them, serves as a stark reminder of the biological imperative for genetic diversity and the human cost when that imperative is ignored. In the end, the Caldwell family tree, so tangled and twisted back on itself that it barely resembled a tree at all, simply stopped growing. There were no more branches to add, no more leaves to unfurl, just silence in a hollow where a family once lived and died, trapped by mountains and blood and choices made long before they were born.